Trying another wet fly this week. This is called the Marsters. This also is in Ray Bergman's book of trout. It is another baitfish imitation. I think anyway that it's more of a baitfish imitation. I did a video last week called the Light Fox, which also I think is going to be a nice baitfish imitation. And I'm trying to knock out a few of these for later on in the season to swing as baitfish. And the Marsters just seem to fit. The basic little wet fly, the tail and the wing are made out of gray mallard. This one has a white floss body, although the recipe calls for white floss or white wool. So if you want something a little chunkier. It's a simple fly to do. It's an interesting fly in that the ones that I have seen have a wrapped collar like this instead of a throat, although it looks like in his book that it is a throat that is at least suggested in terms of how the hackle is tied in. I'll talk more about that as we get to the fly. But that's the Marsters, and I'll go ahead and get started tying. I'm going to start the Marsters by placing my hook in the vise. This is a Mustad 3399 in a size 6. Size 4 would also be good for if you're going to fish this mostly as a baitfish pattern. I'm going to debarb the hook. I'll attach my thread. For thread, I'm using a Danville 6/0 white to start out with because I have a white floss body on this. You don't want to darken up that floss. I'm going to attach my thread about an eye length behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to advance it down the hook shank to just past the point of the hook, and that's where I'll tie in the tip. The tip on the Marsters is a gold tinsel. I'm going to use a Danville size 14 gold Mylar tinsel. I want to attach that to the hook with the silver side up. I'll put in another 4 wraps moving down the hook shank, turn the hook over, and then I'll apply the gold tinsel for my tip. 4 wraps down, 4 wraps back up. My tip in place, I can tie in the tail. The tail on the Marsters is a mallard flank. There's a lot of different feathers you could use for this. The important thing for me, at least, is that the tips on these mallard flanks, on the barbs on the mallard flanks, are in good shape. You select a feather. Let me find one here. I select a feather like this, and I want to use it. It's not really great for wings. Could use it, I suppose, for a throat too, but a lot of the barbs right here are very wispy. The tips, there's not much to them. They're kind of ragged, and especially on this side, they're very uneven. I wouldn't want to use any of those. Now, the ones right up here are nice and even. They're a little sparse on the ends, but that's the way the mallard flank is usually, the barbs are. Anyway, I would use some of these right here, maybe, 10 to 12 barbs for the tail, simply because they're all more uniform. So keep that in mind when you're stripping these out. This particular feather, I took the fluff off I did leave some of this right here where you can see the tips aren't that great. So I would probably peel that off. And then I'm getting down more to barbs that are usable for a tail. As I said, I'm going to take anywhere from 10 to 12 barbs. Depends on the size of the hook. I'm going to kind of roll those and bunch those together to make a little bit of a tail post. I'm going to tie that in about a shank length long. Secure that in with a few wraps, and that's the tail. If the other ends of the barbs extend too far out, you want to trim those back the length of the body. Marsters has no rib on it, and the body is a floss. I'm using a Danville 4-strand rayon in white. I'm going to use all 4 strands on this size hook. I'm going to attach that my side of the hook shank. A couple of wraps in to secure it. A little bit of wax on my thread. Give me a little bit better grip. And then I'm going to bind that in as I work my way forward, and then I'll apply the floss for the body. Look at the recipe in Ray Bergman's trout. It calls for a body of either white floss or white wool. I opted for the floss on this one because last week I did a video on the light fox, which used wool for the body. I'm going to attach the black thread to finish the fly off. This is a Danville 6/0 in black. Get some wax on my thread. There is not a throat on this, or at least in this particular version, in this style. I'm not tying the hackle in as a throat. Rather interesting, and I will put a picture here of the Marsters from Ray Bergman's trout. And the thing that you'll notice is it looks like the red hackle is a throat. In the recipe, it just calls for a scarlet hackle. The picture, the way I see it as being drawn, is that it is actually a throat. It's underneath. There are other flies that are in his book that it's clear that the hackle is tied in, it's wrapped in as a collar. Now, I'm a little bit vague on why some people will tie it in as a collar and some people will tie it in as a throat. Obviously, I don't think it's written in stone just because it's in Ray Bergman's trout that you have to do it a certain way. But the one that I ran across that I liked had the hackle in as a collar. And I've had a couple of people ask me to do a few more wet flies where you got a wing and a collared hackle as opposed to a throat. So I thought this was a good opportunity to go ahead and do that. So the next step is going to be to tie in the wing. The wing is also a gray mallard flank. I'm using a feather that has the tips up here at the end that are all fairly even. I will clip out the center of that so that I have a little bit of a V in there. And then peeling back just some of these fibers, I'm going to get some of these fibers out of the way here so that this portion right up front is what I'll make my wing out of. Keep in mind that these would all make great tails for other marsters if that's what you're going to be tying. I'll fold those together to make my wing. I'll tie that in so that the tip is about halfway down the tail. Take your time with this, with all of this that's going on in front. It can get to be a little bit much. Just take your time. Securing that in, I can double check my wing. Got a few barbs that have snuck around down on the bottom side, so I'm just going to undo that. Tie that in again. That one's a little bit cleaner. Trim away the excess. And as I said, these barbs that are left here off of this feather, I would set these aside, and that's what I would tie some more marsters with. At least they make great tails. You can even set them aside if you've got some other wet flies that use those for tailing. Set that aside, it'll come in handy. Now, in order to palmer this hackle on here, I have to clean this up. This is very important because it looks like I'm finishing the fly off, but I'm not. What I'm really doing is making certain that I have a nice, clean, level platform to palmer this hackle on. I should say collar this hackle in, and it won't, as the rachis is being applied, it won't tend to pop down or move around on me. Now, for this fly, I'm using some Schlappen for a hackle. You have the right size feathers in like a nice scarlet red duck or something like that. Not duck, hen, or something like that. Then go ahead and use that. But I tried some strong rooster hackles, and they're a little bit stiffer than I care for. The one thing I caution you is make certain, depending on the size hook that you're using, you're getting a hackle that is going to be somewhat narrow. In other words, some of these will broaden out from the tip right away. This one in particular, you got the tip right there and it broadens out. The barbs right about here are going to be the ones that are on the very outside of that collar. You want the length to extend about to the inside of the gap of the hook, anywhere between the barb of the hook and the throat of the hook. This one would be too long, so you want to try and find a feather, and you may not have any in here. That is always a possibility. If all you've got is some strung rooster, by all means use it. That's what you have, or you could also tie this in as a throat. In that case, some of these nice webby Schlappen hackles like this would be great for tying in as a throat. But if you've got some in here like this that are a little narrower, narrow being up at this end up here, they start out narrow and they come down narrow as opposed to coming down and getting wide. If they get wide, then the barbs are going to be much longer. This one you could tie in by the tip and wrap it about all the way down to here and still have barbs that are the length that you're looking for. I'm going to take my hackle, holding it by the tip, I'm going to stroke those barbs in a rearward direction, and I'll cut off the end of that tip, give myself a little triangle to tie that in, little anchor. I'm going to wrap that in, working my way down to just behind the eye of the hook. You can try and fold these back if you want. I find that they don't fold all that well, or maybe I just don't have the technique down for doing that. I tend to pull on these too much and then pull the tip out from under those thread wraps. But take your time with it a little bit. Try and fold some of that back. It does help. I find that I usually get anywhere from 5 to 6 wraps of the Schlappen in to make that collar. I'm going to be working my way up forward. What this does for me is two things. It gives me a nice, short, full collar underneath the longest fibers, I should say the longest barbs, so that when I get to the eye like this, I get one more wrap in. You can see these barbs are just a little bit longer than I wanted, but I think it'll work fine. Once I get my last wrap in, I will secure that against the eye of the hook with a couple wraps. I'm going to fold that hackle back. I'm going to stroke all of those fibers back, all of those barbs. And here I will start to wrap right behind the eye of the hook, working my way backwards. What this is doing is it is binding in those barbs in a rearward direction, making the head of the fly a nice transition down to the eye. It is also binding in the rachis of this feather to the point where that's soft enough I can just pop that right off. I don't have to cut it off. Now I can flatten my thread. Flattening the thread just allows me to do the whip finish and use the whip finish and the flat thread to smooth the head off a little bit. I'll put some black lacquer on this anyway, but this will give me a little bit smoother base. I usually cut my thread off, but that one popped right off, and that happens sometimes. Got just a little bit of black thread underneath here. As a fishing fly, I really wouldn't worry about that. And there is the Marsters with a collared hackle. Again, that's a little bit on the long side, but I think it'll work just fine for a fishing fly. Head cement, just half a drop on both sides of that head. That will soak down in there. Once that is dried in a few minutes, I will come back and put a couple of coats of black lacquer on there to finish out the wet fly. So there's the Marsters. Another little baitfish pattern. I'm tying some of these up so that when we get into the streamer bite later on in this year, I'll have some to play around with and to try. I think this will, like the light fox that I did last week, will be a very interesting baitfish imitation. With the gray mallard in there, it'll have some nice contrast, and the red hackle. Tie some up. Try some of them with a throat instead of a wrapped collar. You never know. You may like one over the other. That is the Marsters, and thanks for watching today. Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern,
please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.